All right, now it is my pleasure to introduce our final speaker today. If you work in fire, if you work with land, if you study fire or fire-adapted ecosystems, you should know Steve Pyne. If you are interested in fire and how we relate to it in Florida, in California, and everywhere in between, you should read Steve Pyne. As a scholar and historian, Steve is a talented storyteller who continues to write about fire in ways that integrates history, ecology, politics, and culture to challenge us to reconsider how we think about fire. Some of his most recent books are Between Two Fires, A Fire History of Contemporary America, and To the Last Smoke, a 9-volume suite of regional fire surveys, including one on Florida, which I'm actually holding right now. Starting after high school and right through graduate school, he spent 15 seasons as a North Rim longshot working fire in Grand Canyon National Park. Steve is an emeritus professor following 33 years of service at Arizona State University. Retired now, he shares that he lives on an urban farm in Arizona where he raises sheep, chickens, and citrus. So without further ado, we have a recorded presentation from Steve Pyne that we will play in just a moment. You may need to adjust your volume on your individual computer if it's too high or too low. And then following the completion of that presentation, we have Dr. Pyne on the webinar today for a live question and answer session. So one moment as we get that presentation started.
Hi, I'm Steve Pyne, and I'm really sorry the pandemic's going to prevent us from being able to meet in person. But I am delighted to be able to talk about fire, which after all is that other contagion, the one without a vaccine.
Actually, the story of humans and fire is a very old one. It's as old as our species. We are now the keystone species for fire. We have a species monopoly over its manipulation. I mean, we got small guts and big heads because we learned to cook food. We went to the top of the food chain because we learned to cook landscapes, and now we've become a geologic force because we've begun to cook the planet. Where to begin the American story, though? Lots of places. I like this particular map, which improbably enough was produced for the 1880 census. So that's what the geography of fire looked like in the country, except, of course, for grasslands and deserts that were not forested. And the darker the area, the more intense the burning. It records 3 kinds of fires, all those fires from nature, all those fires being set by people, and the new disturbance in the forest, all those fires being set or made possible by the conversion to a fossil fuel economy, symbolized here aptly with locomotives. Our first professional forester, Bernard Furneaux, looked over the scene and dismissed it as bad habits and loose morals. Furneaux came from Prussia. In his mind, civilized countries didn't do this. Well, a lot of different kinds of data sources went into this map. This is part for Utah. It's done by this guy, John Wesley Powell, whose survey of Utah was published in 1878, one of the great conservation documents of the era, and actually mapped fires. I realize none of us likes to have a lot of text on PowerPoints. I don't like to receive it. I don't like to give it. But I don't know a good alternative in this case, and I want to show some of the actual text. So in this case, Powell is very clear that most of the fires they're mapping are set by American Indians, mostly for hunting, but also because they've been driven out of their traditional homelands and are using fire to sort of make their new landscapes more habitable for burning. Here's the Plumas National Forest Boundary Survey, describing how nearly everyone in the region is burning. So the white man picked up the torch dropped by the Indians, who were accustomed to burning it, that was widely understood, and have come to think of fire as a part of the forest and a beneficial part of that. All classes share in this view and all set fires: sheepmen and cattlemen, miners, lumbermen, ranchmen, sportsmen, campers. Only rarely do they take action to prevent them or to stop them, and that is when life or property is immediately threatened. Okay, so There's California. Here's Gifford Pinchot, then head of the Bureau of Forestry, will become chief forester in 1905, arguing that, like the question of slavery, the question of forest fires may be shelved for a while, but sooner or later it must be met. He was speaking about the fire scene in southern New Jersey. And here he is in 1910, the same year as the Great Fires, and arguing that in the early days, these fires were simply considered acts of God, against which any opposition was hopeless, and any attempt to control them was not merely hopeless but childish. They came in the natural order of things. Today, we understand that forest fires are wholly within the control of man. Actually, today I would completely invert his argument. And here's Inman Eldridge, young forester, speaking of the Florida National Forest, writing in 1911. The popular sentiment is unqualifiedly in favor of the annual burning over of the pineries, homesteaders, cattlemen, turpentine operators, camp hunters, everybody. All these classes of people have for a great number of years been accustomed to burning the woods freely and without hindrance of any kind, and they all have the most positive belief that burning is necessary and best in the long run. In fact, we can go nearly all over the country and find equivalent kinds of statements. So there was burning, deliberate burning for various purposes, usually tied with agriculture, was very widespread in the country. Florida was particularly notorious. State forester once announced that 115% of the state had burned in 1 year. The reason being that open range ranching, which occupied most of the interior of Florida, people burned more than once. So the same area might be burned twice in 1 year. The story of fire, sort of an American way of fire, has a special moment in 1910. In August, the big blow-up in the northern Rockies traumatized the Forest Service, really created the firefighting arrangement that is still very much with us. But that same month, a controversy boiled over in California, particularly Northern California, that became known as light burning. And it argued that this whole approach to large call-outs and kind of paramilitary response to firefighting was misguided. That what we really needed to do was to emulate the American Indian, who routinely burned over the forests. Now, not all of every forest. These were montane forests, lower forests, mostly the pine lands, but they were regularly burned, or what was called light burning. Foresters, led by the Forest Service, dismissed this as Paiute forestry, but the light burning controversy proved very stubborn and will continue well into the 1920s and beyond. In fact, it was seen as a political as well as intellectual challenge. Here's Aldo Leopold in 1920, having helped set up the fire protection system in the southwestern national forest, arguing that the policy of absolutely preventing fires, insofar as possible, is directly threatened by the light-burning propaganda. Here's Stuart Shaw and Edward Kodak in 1924 summarizing their research into California forestry and fire, and noting that when the forests were first being reserved, beginning in 1891, forest burning was an established practice, and the idea that fires could be excluded was generally regarded as preposterous, and the most gloomy pictures were drawn of any such attempt. In fact, they predicted large, uncontrollable fires, diseased forests, insect outbreaks, everything that in fact has happened. Then, as fire protection became established, young growth began to fill up the open forest. The amount of fuels increased, and thereupon people began deliberately or surreptitiously reintroducing fire, and now it became a political argument as well as a kind of quasi-scientific one, and light burners and sort of laissez-faire burners were deemed a very serious threat, not only because of their burning, their, quote, direct action, but even more so because of their open preaching of fire, which threatened to undermine the authority of the Forest Service and indeed forestry, the science behind it, on other matters. Instead, California produced what was called systematic fire protection in the California forests and produced demonstration forests to try to show the effectiveness of systematic control. There we are with Mount Shasta in the background. It's amazing how much of this was fought over in Northern California, where we're still dealing with these issues. And then in the southeast, the best known figure, Herbert Stoddard, studying bobwhite quail, connecting wildlife, habitat, and fire. And then in 1931, the cooperative quail study helped to promote it, in this case arguing in favor of burning. Persistence in the southeast was baffling to many because, again, so much of it was private land. It was not public land. This was an effort in the late 20s by the Forest Service and American Forestry Association to propagandize against wood burning, modeling themselves on the traveling revivalist tent shows that traversed the region and calling themselves the Dixie Crusaders, getting people to confess that they'd been woods burners and take the pledge to stop. When that proved ineffective, the agency actually turned to psychology and hired this man, John Shea, one of the most loathed figures in southeastern fire history, to study the psychology. Why did these people insist that fire was useful? They had no science behind them. They had nothing except tradition to go on and their own experience, and it was completely baffling why they would insist repeatedly that fire was useful, and they didn't want fire removed. They wanted more of it put in. In the 1930s, several things happened. The whole story intensifies with the New Deal, and particularly the Civilian Conservation Corps, about half of whose chores went into fire or actual firefighting or pre-suppression. And a series of challenges boiled up. Herbert Chapman, forester at Yale, began doing studies of fire in the southern pines. S.W. Green studied fire again in the southeast for rangeland, and our friend Stoddard dealing it with wildlife. All of these were suggesting that there was a value in fire and indeed a necessity for it. This came to a head in 1935. Chapman actually succeeded in organizing a panel at the Society of American Forestry annual convention on fire, and at this point it was revealed that a lot of Forest Service experiments in the southeast, what had been demonstration plots, really not really experiments, suppressed information when it didn't affirm policy, and in a sense they simply couldn't believe that that what their forestry techs had told them could be wrong. And so anyway, this was revealed, and also in the spring 1935, Chief Forester Gus Silcox with the CCC, to provide added muscle, promoted the alternative. That is, an experiment on a continental scale, as he called it, what became known as the 10 a.m. policy. In 1942, Raymond Canaro, Forest Service employee, wrote an extraordinary article, The Place of Fire in Southern Forestry, in which he promoted the idea of what he called prescribed fire. And he did it as a compromise between two extremist groups, one that wanted all fire excluded, and the other which wanted the free use of fire whenever and however anyone chose. It's a remarkable article. Actually, it's kind of eerie how much the polarization on the issue echoes many issues today. And it's really one of the classic pieces of literature in American fire history. 1942. 1943, Harold Weaver, with the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the West, was promoting articles of fire in ponderosa pine. And then, having trained in the late 40s in the Southeast. Harold Biswell carried what he had learned to California, and by 1951 is promoting burning in California, both in pines and in what was called brush, to promote mostly wildlife and range, but also to reduce fuels. So all of these are sort of coming into play in a stronger way. Very, very diverse group, different parts of the country, different backgrounds. The exception, though, is made first in the Florida National Forests. In 1943, they are allowed to practice prescribed fire, which Canaro had just sort of defined the year before. So they have the concept, but it's also World War II is underway, and the CCC is gone. The whole 1910 generation passed away from the agency by 1939. Lyle Watts, their successor, came of age in this slightly different context. So all of this sort of contributed to why there was a shift at this time. And we also ought to point out that Florida had a history of fire exceptionalism. In the 1930s, the predecessor to the Fish and Wildlife Service authorized prescribed fire in Florida. The Forest Service, 1943, the Park Service, 1954. These were the first agency authorizations, all of them occurring in Florida. And then in 1962, Tall Timbers begins its annual fire ecology conferences. So by the 1970s, really, the Florida model was being taken as kind of a national paradigm. So despite the issue being all over the country in various forms, Florida became the particular focus. 1962, Tall Timbers, hugely influential series of conferences. That same year, the Nature Conservancy conducted its first prescribed fire, this on a prairie in Minnesota. And I'll give you just sort of a quick chronology here. The Leopold Report for the National Park Service, 1963, arguing that fire needed to be restored. It was one of the great disruptions in the system. Looking to the Sierra forests, again, we're back in California, as a particularly notorious example of what could go wrong. 1964, the Wilderness Act, as one fire officer noted, it practically made it illegal to put out a lightning fire in a wilderness area. By 1968, the National Park Service had adopted a new policy putting fire restoration front and center, including prescribed fire. 71, 72, the Park Service and Forest Service were both creating natural fire programs. By 73, Forest Service changed from a Division of Fire Control to a Division of Fire Management, and things like DESCON were appearing. This in the Francis Marion and Sumter National Forests in South Carolina, finding ways to integrate fire of any source into burning objectives. And then by 1978, the Forest Service, with a series of wholesale reforms, comes on board. And what we have really is a national policy of fire by prescription. So the prescribed fire, as Canaro first defined it, and others had codified it in practice, as one form, trying to get natural fires into the system. We have a prescribed natural fire, and don't try to parse the philosophy behind that. But it was an effort to have some sense of control over the reintroduction of fire. And even in wildfire options, you could confine container control. So the 10 a.m. policy is not the only approach authorized. This is in 1978. And the confine option could look pretty much like prescribed natural fire, and the contain option could look like prescribed fire done as part of burnouts, if they chose. The problem was people didn't choose. But I think this is a Carolina Sandhills story of fire, wild and prescribed, and I think this was the ideal. This is what the architects of the new program hoped would happen nationwide, that an area that had a lot of wildfire and a little prescribed fire here and there gradually makes the transition and is able to scale up to the point where it essentially has no wildfire and prescribed fire has taken its place. And this, in a sense, was I think, the desired outcome. nationally. And in the 60s and 70s, the conditions may have existed nationally to implement this at a fairly large scale, but it didn't happen. So we have what I think was the fire revolution, this change in policy, reorienting the whole country to a kind of prescribed fire as a foundational doctrine up through 78. But you need some space to make a new policy like this happen. This was a revolution at the top. Number of failures, Saney in 76, a couple of prescribed natural fires that blew up in Colorado and Idaho, and Michigan, a prescribed fire burns through a town and kills one operator. At the meantime, in the 80s, change in national election, the whole polarization that has come to characterize American life and politics is set into play, and we have a new disturbance, which is the spread of urban sprawl, or a kind of urban recolonization of what had been rural America, and watching cities burn. I mean, it's like watching polio come back. What's wrong with this picture? Anyway, when you add it all up, I think it makes for a counter-revolution. Not enough to roll back everything, but enough to stall it in place. And that will continue until the 1994 fire season, at which point the whole thing starts up again. But I think the main window has passed. Two big fires, prescribed fire breakdowns, characterize this latter part, the Yellowstone fires, prescribed natural fires. The problem was Yellowstone used that doctrine, but didn't have any prescriptions in their management. They were, in effect, let burns. And then a prescribed fire set by the Park Service outside Los Alamos in New Mexico blew up, escaped, and the Cerro Grande became the largest fire in New Mexico history at that time, certainly the most expensive fire in American wildland fire history, and was a major setback. Both of these were setbacks for the prescribed fire programs that they helped to advertise. Then in 2000 fire season breakdowns, the Cerro Grande fire, breakdown in fire lighting, large fires in the northern Rockies. Here we are, right back, to 1910. 90 years later, we still can't stop these fires, so we couldn't fight them either. And a national fire plan is a consequence. Not too little, maybe too much in some ways, but certainly too late. One of the interesting things to come out of this transition is the role of a civil society, independent research operations to challenge what had been government orthodoxy and even hegemony. Tall Timbers is actually now on the National Register of Historic Places. Quite an amazing feat for a fire project. We have a national coalition of prescribed fire councils, spreading the doctrine again to private landowners as well as public, finding ways to bring fire back. We have organizations like the Nature Conservancy. Hey, TNC now does as much burning per year as the National Park Service. So we have a civil society which is becoming a major player as well. How does prescribed fire look today? This is the latest survey by state. You can see the distribution heavily concentrated in the southeast, lightest in the farthest northeast. By resource purpose, forestry dominates 80%. Agriculture used to dominate. It continues to recede. By region, 2/3 is in the southeast. This used to be higher. The southeast has actually been declining somewhat, and the west is now growing. And nationally, looking at the trends, we can see that paradoxically, despite all the effort, despite 40 years of official doctrine, we're actually falling behind in many areas. We're at best holding our own. There are a number of ways to interpret that, and maybe we can get to them later. And this is how it looks to NASA. Satellites, MODIS satellites recording hotspots. So some of those yellow ones particularly are wildfires. and the red are prescribed fires heavily concentrated in the southeast of the Great Plains. But then look further south to the Caribbean and to Mexico, and you can see that we're still a long way from what traditional agriculture would use. So how can we think about prescribed fire? Well, there are a lot of prescribed fires now, and it differs by region. The southeast, thanks to tall timbers and the way the fire revolution unfolded, became a model, a kind of exemplar, but this was what it looked like in Canaro's day. It was tied to forestry plantations primarily. You wait for a north wind. After a cold front had passed, you would burn out in strips. Now, much more variety by seasons, variety by intensity, trying to get a better mix of fires for ecological purposes, not simply for fuel reduction. In the West, a lot of what passes for prescribed burning is tied in with thinning operations, and it's actually pile burning. The other form is actually managed wildfire, or what I think of as a box and burn strategy. This is actually from the San Carlos Apache Reservation. Had a couple of lightning fires, Skunk and Basin. Could have put them out basically in one tree, and decided to work with those, to push and pull them for several weeks. Since this was an area they had targeted for burning and had been unable to get all the pieces to align in the right way, and they ended up with about 83,000 acres. So what do we call this? Yeah, this is half suppression, half prescribed fire done under urgent conditions. This is certainly not the Florida model prescribed fire that developed in the 1970s. It's something different, and this has become a very successful strategy throughout much of the Southwest. It's used a lot in the northern Rockies as well. And then there's a case of Alaska, which probably has as close to a natural fire regime as any place in the United States, and a real mixture of things, using different techniques, working with fires, partly suppressing, partly burning, doing extensive burning, doing extensive monitoring, lots of things, getting fire on the land without trying to suppress it all, or without designating as a kind of set piece prescribed fire. And another element has come into vogue very recently, and this, we don't really have a good term for it in the U.S. I'm going to borrow one from Australia and call it cultural burning. In a certain sense, all burning is cultural burning if it's going to succeed. But this is aimed as restoration. Not it's done mostly by tribal groups, and it's aimed for cultural, even political restoration, as well as ecological health. But it also points out, as I suggest, that a fire culture is critical. If you've got a working fire culture, you can manage fire, with or without science. Otherwise, you can have all the science you want and all the techniques and all the machinery you want, and if you don't have the right culture, it's not going to happen. And this is our first, Western Civ's first image of Australian Aborigines. It's from Cook's first expedition. There's a family returning from fishing, and you notice that it's the kid who holds the fire stick. Well, how is he going to learn if he isn't allowed to use fire just as a part of normal daily life? There is a fire culture, and that, in a sense, is what we have to find a surrogate for. So what might we think about the future of prescribed fire? Well, here are my thoughts. And all of them are going to occur against a larger backdrop of something that I'm beginning to call the piracy. And this is my idea that when you add up all of humanity's combustion practices, both the burning of living landscapes and what I've come to call lithic landscapes, that is fossil fuel, we're creating the fire equivalent of an ice age. And fire is going to be more and more a presence, an informing presence, not that it burns every day, every year, in every place, but that more and more of our world is going to be shaped by humanity's fire habits.
Well, what does a full-blown fire age look like? We're about to find out. And we might begin pursuing this analogy to a contagion a bit further. Hardening houses against ember storms sounds a lot like wearing masks to prevent aerosol dispersion. Defensible space, it's called social distancing. It reminds us that we're part of a group. If we take measures to protect ourselves and our neighbors don't, we're still at risk. And how about herd immunity? Sounds like good fires helping to contain bad ones. So we're looking at a lot of fires, and I suspect we will be playing with and introducing a lot more fires. But at that point, it matters how we imagine fire. For the most part, we present it as a physical tool. Fire is just a physical chemical reaction, interacts with landscapes. In some ways, it's no different than a candle or a blowtorch. And that's what a drip torch is. We use it to reduce fuel. So it's a physical treatment to reduce the physical accumulation of biomass that is potentially a fuel. We could even burn it amid snow if we wanted. But when we put that drip torch into a landscape, it becomes something different. It becomes an ecological process. And that makes it really a biotechnology. And when we put it in a landscape that we have fairly good control over, say, or have constructed, say, a field of wheat that's now being burned off its stubble, we can think about that as a kind of tame fire. In some ways, it's less like a blowtorch or a wood chipper than it is like sheep or cattle. It's converting, it's biologically converting that mass, not simply consuming it. And when we introduce fire into a wild or quasi-wild setting, then it's not really tame, is it? It's more like a captured fire, the way you would capture an elephant or a bear and then train it to do various acts. It's really a broad spectrum ecological catalyst. And while we have certain controls over it, it has the possibility of going feral at any time. We have, I think, not imagined fire deeply enough as a biological phenomenon. We want to reduce it to simple physics because that allows us to count things easily. It allows us to measure things. It allows us to appear scientific. But it doesn't, I think, really capture the full spectrum of what we're doing. And it doesn't really make a compelling case for fire. Because if all fire is doing, all our prescribed burning is doing is reducing fuels, then we'll be told to find another tool to do it. Use wood chippers, haul it off, dig it up, do something else with it so we don't have smoke, so we don't have possible escapes, we don't have various inconveniences. We will use internal combustion to process it rather than open flame. That seems to me a formula to remove prescribed fire from the landscape, except in certain settings where it's simply too large to ignore. I think if we really value fire as an ecological process, then we have to make that case for it, not simply as fuel. The fuel falls out as something that happens when we get landscape burning right. But whatever the future turns out to be, I think we may have occasion to recall the warnings of the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel, who declared they shall go out from one fire and another fire shall devour them. We will always be caught between fires. Hey, that's what it means to be human. Thanks for your attention.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for that presentation, Steve. Make sure that your audio works so that we can get your responses.
Yeah. Well, speaking of audio, I'll apologize for the poor quality. I think we had both tested it and thought it was fine, and it turns out it was much too light to be heard easily. So I'm sorry for that, and I have to say, having to listen to myself on a pre-recorded presentation is a little too postmodern for my taste, but I do appreciate the invitation to present, and I hope to exchange a little bit now.
Great. Well, we appreciate your time and thanks for joining us. And in response to the audio, we are recording our meeting today. And so we will try and work to increase that audio in post-production before we get it onto YouTube.
Okay. Well, thank you.
You bet. So folks, we do have time remaining. I hope that you'll take the opportunity to type your questions into the Q&A tool in Zoom, and we'll go through and try and field those questions. I see we've already got some folks just providing some good feedback, and we'll give people a chance to put their questions in the chat window right now. So here's one that comes in from Callie, and Callie says, you know, how can we use what the public is seeing in the American West to help us continue or expand the use of fire as an ecological process in the South?
Well, that's a great question, and I can certainly sympathize with John Sadler's comments that we don't want to seem to be picking at the carcass in California right now. But I think people generally have got the idea that fire can be and is a natural process, and that fire can be used. They're concerned about it happening improperly or in their backyard. And I think demonstration plots are great. And Florida has got lots of stories. You've got a tradition. I would just continue to do that. And I wouldn't necessarily make that the basis of your argument. But if people say, well, it doesn't really matter if we continue to let this grow for 20 or 30 years, what will happen? Then you might say, well, have you looked at Paradise, California recently? I think you could bring it up in an appropriate way at that point. California, I have to say, every time I start a fire story, I see a fire story in Florida, sooner or later it ends with prescribed fire. But every fire story I can think of, at least for the last century or more in California, ends with suppression. And they have tried multiple times to reintroduce fire, and each time it has failed. So Florida has some natural advantages, but you've certainly put them to good use, and you've gotten ahead of the case. California has some real problems, but they could have taken a different path and didn't.
Here's an interesting question from Zach. Zach says, you know, how do we raise the political will to fund prescribed fire as a part of any new Green New Deal or a new CCC?
Well, I think that there's legislation. You know, it's been submitted to advance that cause, and you know, we can hope for the best. But I see that California, which after I think the 2018 fires had appropriated $1 billion for mitigation and fuel mitigation and community protection to CAL FIRE over a 5-year period, has now rescinded the first, has rescinded this year's because of all the other costs. So you're going to be overwhelmed by it. I don't have a good solution to that. I think you have to do a bunch of things. We can certainly support it. You know, I'm a little distressed listening to the presentations earlier about some of the difficulties Florida is experiencing, because Florida, as much as any place in the country, has got it right. Alaska, for different reasons, seems to be on top of it. But if Florida's struggling, you know, I'm trying to imagine all the other places that are trying to introduce it. I think the big story, the other big story in getting to the public, is that we have traditionally had two stories we tell about fire. One is fire is a disaster, and there are fires that are disasters. The other is the firefight as a kind of battlefield, which has ill-served us, frankly. And you don't fight a bad narrative or an inappropriate narrative by facts and evidence. You fight it with a better narrative. And Florida has worked hard at this, but I don't think we've quite turned the corner. And generally, nationally, we still don't have good narratives of equal power. to counter the ones that have governed how we think about fire. So my advice to groups when I'm asked is that I think the first point you start with is that, as the campaign Florida Forest Service is doing, is about protect. You're going to ensure that people's lives and property are protected, and then you're going to expand beyond that. So, and prescribed fire is a great way to do that. Certainly in California, it is no longer possible to even pretend that we can counter these large fires under extreme conditions. So at that point, you can explain, getting more fire engines, getting more air tankers isn't going to protect your place. When fires are in those conditions with those kinds of winds and fuels, they are out of control until the wind stops. And you could begin with that and suggest there are other ways. Let's harden the houses, let's focus on other things, and then begin getting the landscape into better shape. I'm sorry, I'm kind of wandering here. You can take the professor out of the classroom, but you may not be able to take the classroom completely out of the professor, and it's too easy to keep talking. So maybe go on to something else.
One of your responses reminds me of a presentation I saw one time from Tim Inglesby with Fusey, where he talks about the power of words and how we have so many military phrases and words that we use to talk about fire, and how that shapes then our perspectives on fire.
Yeah, I think we have a very poor vocabulary for fire. And I also think that we really need to strengthen our science models. It is so overweighted in terms of fire behavior. I love all that stuff, but we apply that language, those concepts, to what is basically a biological or ecological problem. And it gets us into difficulties. The point I tried to make, if all we're doing is reducing fuel, there are lots of ways to do that, and fire may not survive.
Here's an interesting question that came in from Kaylin. Kaylin asks, how do we talk about prescribed burning, and then as it's related to the release of CO2 or greenhouse gases? So how do we continue to talk about prescribed fire with climate change?
Yeah, people confuse these really large, massive fires that release huge amounts of carbon with smaller fires that behave differently. The deal is that fire is fundamentally conservative, and as long as the larger environmental conditions persist, it will return to what it was before. So all the stuff that's being released when we prescribe fire is going to be recaptured. And particularly if you've got your prescriptions down to the point where you're dealing with primarily grasses and low shrubs and something of the rough, that's going to be recaptured in a year or two. So there is no net transfer involved here. In fact, you may be storing a small amount of carbon in the soil. So it's one of the few ways we have of putting carbon back into the geologic stratum. So that would be my argument. When you allow these conflagrations to rumble through places, you are creating a net transfer, and we don't really want that. But there are lots of ways in which regular burning assists carbon storage. Trees can grow in places where they would be wiped out by fires if you do proper kind of burning. A lot of small burns at the right time of the year can then protect against larger fires. That is actually a carbon sequestering project. And that's the flip side of that, is if these campaigns to plant billions of trees or whatever, all you're going to do is create more fuel unless you introduce burning with that. So prescribed fire can actually assist the project, not simply add to the problem.
Here's an interesting question from Greg. And Greg says, we often hear from Western folks, fire or not, that you can do prescribed fire here. Greg's referring to the east or the southeast, but not out west. So how do we counter this without being defensive or accusatory?
Well, I just say, I think the Florida model, or models, since you've got a plurality now, have not transferred to the Western US at scale. And it's not that the model's inherently wrong, it's just that it has to operate in a particular ecological and cultural context. It's different, and it may not work. But there's a lot of burning that's going on now with managed wildfires. I watched a couple out of my window earlier this year in the Southwest. Have been very active in it. Large chunks of the Northern Rockies are doing it. And that concept is spreading. We need to get better at it. But that is how the West is getting its good fire. It's just too complicated, too encumbered, too small to do what you can do in Florida. And there are other kinds of quirky things that you wonder, why is this the case? I can think of the Endangered Species Act, all of the birds. In Florida, all of them are sort of firebirds, and you can use the Endangered Species Act to add leverage for prescribed fire to sustain the proper habitat. I mean, the red-cockaded woodpecker, the Florida scrub jay, the Bachman sparrow further west. But all of the birds I can think of that would be involved in the West are all being used against it. All the varieties of spotted owls, now the sage grouse in the Great Basin, and a few others. Why we have this division is very curious, but it means that the West is going to have to restore fire, get good fire, right fire back on the landscape by other means than just expanding prescribed fire, because I don't see any evidence that we can do that at scale. And we're certainly not going to have the money for it.
Here's an interesting comment and question that came in from the chat window from Jeff. And Jeff says, you know, we must fight, you said we must fight a narrative with a better narrative, so a better story. He says, would making a really well done and accurate past and present documentary about fire, wildfire, and prescribed fire, and how it has and should be used in the US help to create or shift this narrative? And then he says, he follows that with, maybe we can convince Ken Burns to make us a documentary. So is Ken Burns going to help us, you think?
Well, that's an interesting thought. I think Ron Howard, now major Hollywood director and Hollywood personality, has done a documentary on Paradise, California, and the rebuilding. And there are others. Fire is becoming a subject, but you're going to need more than a documentary. I mean, I think we'll have succeeded when Hollywood produces an action movie that stars a prescribed burner or equivalent. And I've actually spent time, expended gray matter, of which I have a finite amount, and it seems to be shrinking, on how you could do that. There are various ways to do that. But until you can get that kind of narrative where it's not just that you're educating people, but there is a drama to it. There is a story that asks, what next? Who is doing this? Who is making the choices that we care about in this? We need that as well. Artists are starting to get interested in fire. We're seeing more of that, which is also encouraging. But we need to make that other transition. What is the prescribed fire equivalent of Ed Pulaski's story? And all these kind of wonderful narratives we have. You know, where's red skies over Montana, sort of green skies over California movie that would have major stars, a real narrative to it, lots of action, lots of moral choices, lots of sort of narrative drama in it, not just a documentary, but something that people can identify with and become involved with. You have to choose the documentary. These other kinds of films, I think, would be more effective.
So we're getting short on time here, but I do want to ask another question, and this gets back to prescribed fire escapes, because it seems like when an escape occurs, that's what gathers the headlines, and that it's the rare occurrence that can do so much damage. And my brother works in fire, and one of his colleagues has a phrase that says, you know, nobody blames the bomb squad when the bomb goes off. right? When
Yeah.
but when there's an escape, it can have negative impacts across an entire region or country. So could you talk about escapes in prescribed fire and in getting messages about prescribed fire out?
Yeah, well, I don't have a good solution for it. Personally, I haven't even found good statistics. I mean, do we know what percentage of prescribed fires escapes? I suspect it's comparable to suppressed fires that escaped initial attack. So the management of natural fires that escape. Anytime you're dealing with fire, we don't control the fire environment. So there's always the possibility of this thing going feral. I think we can embed those stories better. I wish I had a formula I could tell you. If I did, I would have it out there. I don't. But we also become very defensive. And the fire community wants to circle the wagons or circle the fire engines, and wants to ensure that we don't call into question the value of prescribed burning by suggesting, well, maybe this group really didn't do it right, or this was something that didn't need to happen. We've done that with prescribed natural fires. I mean, the Yellowstone fires really were a let burn program. Yellowstone had a fire plan that included prescriptions, and they took out all the prescriptions. And it was entirely to the judgment of its fire committee. So that story didn't get out, that this is not how we manage fires. Yellowstone didn't play by the rules, and that was part of the problem. Or the Cerro Grande fire in the Southwest. Okay, I don't understand why, personally, I don't understand why you were lighting a fire upwind of Los Alamos with no treated territory land between Los Alamos and your burn at a time when the prevailing winds are out of the Southwest and they're hot, dry, and windy, when all of the big fires blow up. So but we can't really criticize them. We're not allowed to discriminate. So somebody got it right, somebody got it wrong, it's just bad luck. Their number came up. And if we don't discriminate, then the public will tend not to believe us. If we always say, well, it's always right, and we need to do more, and yeah, we needed to push it, and so forth. I think that we lose our credibility if we are not prepared to sort through these events and be honest. Mm-hmm. And be honest that, fire is not completely in our control, but the alternative here is to have completely uncontrollable, not only uncontrolled, but uncontrollable fires that will do a whole lot more damage. And this is a risk we're prepared to take, and there are going to be some mistakes. We will do our best, and we will try first to make sure that lives and property are secure before we light up. I'm not sure what else to do, but I've been disappointed at conferences and other discussions where we just refuse to sort out that maybe somebody goofed. It happens.
All right. There's one more question that came in from Evan that I want to get to if you've got a moment, and I think we'll use it to wrap things up. And Evan says, we often hear about getting more prescribed fire to the west following the Florida model, right? So what lessons can we, those of us in Florida or the Southeast, what lessons can we take from the West to improve our own fire programs here?
Well, I think you're doing some, and where you've got land to operate on, I'm thinking of South Florida area, Big Cypress and others, being willing to work with existing fires, wildfires, and draw a larger box, work with those fires, and get some more acres burned under times and places where it's suitable. Florida has a lot less room to roam than many of the Western places, but you're taking advantage of that. And I also think if you've been expanding your concept of prescribed fire, it was a very tightly choreographed set piece. And now it's much more flexible in terms of seasonality, in terms of windows and so forth. And I think you're doing okay. The problem is I would be leery about saying that we can do it in Florida, so you can do it in Oregon, or you can do it in Idaho. The conditions are going to be different, and we can all learn from each other.
All right, well, with that, thank you so much for joining us today, Steve. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you everyone who provided questions, and this has been an enjoyable conversation.
And if there are other questions, send me an email. I'd be happy to reply.